So welcome this morning. The Newton South Speech and Debate team will be presenting a debate about government surveillance this morning. I'm going to ask our debaters to come up and introduce themselves and also to tell you a little bit about the structure of what they'll be doing, and then they will begin.
Hi, so I'm Aisha Pateja, one of the captains on the debate team. And what we're going to be doing today is a debate on government surveillance. And it's going to be like a parliamentary sort of debate where you guys can snap your fingers if you like what you hear, and you're hearing an argument and you agree with it. So let's everybody practice that right now. Snap your fingers. Yeah, there you go. All right. So it's like a fun way to keep you guys engaged. There's also going to be a part where you guys actually get to ask questions to the debaters at one point. So consistently think about questions that you may have or like arguments that you don't think make sense. But yeah, and so
hi, I'm Malcolm. I'm another captain of the Newton South Debate team. I just want to talk a little bit about the topic we'll be debating in the program. So the topic we'll be debating is resolve the United States federal government should substantially curtail its domestic surveillance in order to promote democracy. So you'll hear Michael and I debating on the affirmative side, saying that that's a true statement, and Mitch and I usually be debating on the negative side, saying that that's not a true statement. And the structure of the debate is going to be on the slideshow. Monitor? Okay, yeah. So the structure of the debate could be up there as well. We can move on to the next slide. And so this is just sort of the speech times we'll be seeing and how long we'll be speaking at any given moment. And with that said, we're going to get started now.
So I'm Michael Ryder. I'm a junior on the speech and debate team, and I'll start when everyone's ready. Our democracy was founded on the principles of personal freedom and privacy. And because most of us can't protect our confidential information on our personal servers, Malcolm and I are proud to affirm that the United States federal government should curtail its domestic surveillance in order to promote democracy. Before we present our arguments, we'd like to make it very clear that this debate is first and foremost about how to improve our democracy and the impact curtailing surveillance will have upon it. Democracy relies on an exchange of ideas between the people within that democracy and opportunities for political activism. Indeed, a key principle of all thriving modern democracies is the protection of free speech and of a free press. Thus, whichever side of the debate best creates space for productive democratic discourse through voting and other mechanisms ought to win this debate. Malcolm and I will provide you with two main arguments in support of today's resolution. The first of which is that curtailing surveillance promotes civic engagement. Surveillance decreases citizens' trust in the government. The Atlantic's Connor Friedersdorf explains that the U.S. intelligence community's mass surveillance and cover-up of warrantless illegal searches has decreased citizens' trust in the government. Preserving the trust of the people is key to a thriving democracy. Roberts of the University of Tennessee finds that voter mistrust in the government reduces motivation for voters to go to the polls, and thus reduces voter turnout. This is devastating because Texas A&M University's Harvey Tucker explains that with lower voter turnout, it becomes more likely that candidates which the majority of citizens oppose get elected, short-circuiting our democracy. Our second argument is that curtailing domestic surveillance would mobilize social movements. This occurs in two ways. The first of which is that government action curtails surveillance that would empower social movements that advocate for reform within our democracy. Case Western Reserve University's Laura Huey found in 2010 that while a social movement focused on reforming the security infrastructure of our nation exists on our country, in order to really get it off the ground, we need to demonstrate to a wider audience that a problem exists that requires individual and collective action. Fortunately, government action that curtails surveillance would do just that, by legitimizing the fledgling movement against surveillance, and demonstrating that change is possible. Empirically, Arizona State's Henry Walker found in 2013 that legitimizing elements of social movements can counteract collective action problems and increase likelihood that self-interested individuals take collective rather than individual action. Second, curtailing surveillance prevents the government from surveilling social movements that advocate for reform. Journalist Derek Royden reports in 2013 that law enforcement has abused its domestic surveillance to monitor and undercut social movements such as the Occupy movement and Black Lives Matter. The University of Wisconsin's Pamela Oliver describes the scope of social movement surveillance. writing that the police, FBI, US Army, and CIA all had major domestic surveillance operations that had placed informers and agents in virtually every movement organization in the country. Journalist Thomas Geist reports that when protests broke out in response to the wrongful death of Freddie Gray, an unnamed US official who spoke with the Post confirmed the use of federal, quote, surveillance assets in support of the military police mobilization of Baltimore. The use of surveillance to shut down protesters and silence activists stifles collective action in the most direct way possible. Social movements are really important. Journalist Archon Fung writes in 2013, the mobilized movements are key to a thriving democracy because, quote, social movements can extend the scope of participation and deliberation in American politics by mobilizing and enabling people to take advantage of such institutional opportunities. Thank you, and we hope that you will stand with us in support of an affirmation.
We negate that the United States federal government should substantially curtail its domestic surveillance in order to promote democracy. Because A, curtailing surveillance does not actually increase democracy, and B, while surveillance, because it leads to a bunch of other things that are more important than democracy. Our first argument is increasing safety. The Swedish Council for Crime Prevention in 2001 identifies 2 ways which surveillance decreases crime and increases safety of the citizens of the United States. First, by stopping attackers. The Council explains that surveillance stops crimes by gathering evidence on the attacker. This is critical for surveillance in the United States. Bash of CNN in 2013 reports that the National Security Agency stopped 50 would-be terrorist attacks, including 2 in the New York subway system and another in the New York Stock Exchange. Second, by deterring crime. According to the Council, criminals are less likely to commit crimes when they know that there's surveillance designed to catch them. For that reason, surveillance reduces crime rates. According to the Urban Institute, violent crime fell about 20% after implementing surveillance. A literature review by the Campbell Corporation in 2006 finds that surveillance reduces overall crime by 16%, and reviews by the Council and Lex Dexter of the University of Amsterdam in 2015 concludes the same. Our second contention is cybersecurity. Euromaidan reports that Russia is going to increase the number of cyber attacks against the West in 2016. The Hill quantifies that the number of cyber attacks on the West has risen from dozens to 10,000 annually. Furthermore, CNN finds that behind a series of damaging intrusions on the West, Russian hackers access important information from the Pentagon and the White House. The West would not be prepared in a world without surveillance, as National Intelligence Director Clapper explains that the #1 threat to national security is cyber attacks. The only way to solve for these attacks, the New Republic explains, is to maintain surveillance in the United States. That's because without surveillance, hackers from other countries are able to enter our private systems through backdoors and take advantage. There are 2 impacts to democracy. First, infrastructure. NBC News explains that energy pipelines, water supply, banks are at risk to hackers. Business Insider reports that just a cyber attack on the East Coast would result in a crippling blow to 93 million people just in New York to be without electricity, constituting a loss in running water and heat. Second, mortality. Business Insider furthers that the attacks from Russia would cause, quote, a rise in mortality rates as health and safety systems fail. When people are dead, they obviously cannot participate in democracy, thus harming it overall. Now let's go over to the opponent's side of the case, where they talk about this debate about democracy. In their framework. So there's a social contract that the government is supposed to provide safety in order for some of our rights. We have guaranteed those rights. We have those rights guaranteed at the end of the day. The purpose of our government is to provide safety, and at the point when we want a successful democracy, then we need the government to provide the people with a safe environment. Thus, our case is a prerequisite to their case. If we win any part of our case, they don't gain access to any of their increased impacts in democracy, because the first and foremost value of the United States government is to provide safety for their people, and because surveillance increases the amount of crime and decreases the amount of crime and decreases mortality rates, then it's a prerequisite to their entire case. Their first argument is about civic engagement. They bring this first one about voter mistrust. 2 main responses. First, plenty of voters are going to the polls. I'm pretty sure in 2016 it was one of the highest voter turnouts ever. Second, I would argue that in a world where our friends and family are getting killed on the streets because surveillance does not exist, that's what leads to mistrust in the government, because the government cannot actually provide safety for their own citizens. They impact to these low voter turnout again. But the issue is, low voter turnout is only going to happen in their world where people are more worried about staying alive than who's going to be their next governor or senator. The second dimension is social movements. Their first warrant is legitimizing movements. The fundamental issue with this argument is that they bring up this social movement of surveillance, and that there's a lot of grassroots organizations that want to curtail surveillance in the status quo. But what they don't understand is that if you curtail surveillance, then those social movements are just going to go away, because then their entire aim has been achieved, thus decreasing the amount of social movements in the United States. So you turn this argument completely, because their argument is literally that you legitimize the social movement that's actually solved, that actually happens in their world. The second warrant is that you cannot surveil social movements and then advocate for reform. But it doesn't make sense, because surveillance can't get rid of social movements, because the point of them is to be really big. Well, let's take an example. Black Lives Matter. I'm pretty sure every single person in this room has heard of Black Lives Matter. That's because social movements in our world are able to be propagated by so much. Like, if they can explain to us why surveillance has specifically led to a decrease in a specific movement without giving broad general statements about these movements being shut down, then maybe we can look at it. But at this point, all they're doing is just providing a random dude who says that social movements surveillance causes social movements to go away. Thank you. Now we're going to have a crossfire between us two for 2 minutes.
Alright, thanks. So let's talk about the second part of your first argument on safety. You talked about crime, right? And you talked about how surveillance is like helping decrease crime. So if I go into a restaurant and I see a camera there and I don't want to commit a crime now, is that a government camera or is that a privately owned one?
Well, I would argue that private surveillance and government surveillance are probably having some degree to which crime is being stopped, but at the end of the day, government surveillance is extremely prevalent in today's society, which is what mainly decreases crime. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so you answer that, in your second one of your second mention, you say that social movements are surveilled, and that shuts them down. Can you give me a single example in the real world of a social movement being shut down because they're being surveilled?
Yeah. So we talked about in our case that social movements like widespread, like they aren't killing them, but they use surveillance to control protests and shut down protests. And protests are often what
Mike, I want a name. What
Black Lives Matter, Occupy movement.
So social movement, Black Lives Matter movement has been shut down because of surveillance.
A lot of the protests have, yeah.
Really?
We talked about that in our case.
Really?
Yeah.
A lot of their protests have been shut down because of surveillance.
Yeah, have been shut down.
Can you give me an example of surveillance that's shutting down Black Lives Matter movements?
Yeah, we talked about it in our case that the government is using surveillance and they're using.
What surveillance, Mike?
What are you asking?
You said they're using surveillance
Yeah.
to shut down social.
Yeah. So
Are they like pointing cameras at them and then everybody just goes away? Like,
Yeah. So they're using their communication and they're using these communications to go and see how, like, where they're going to
How?
protest.
How?
What do you mean how? They're looking like
How
they're
is this
surveilling.
impacted?
Yeah, they're impacting because then they know where the people are. So when they know where the people are, they're going to shut down the movement.
So if you're arguing that like these social movements, like all their like organizations and all the times when they're trying to protest are going away, can you give me an example of a location that they were going to go to that got shut down because of government surveillance?
Yeah, they use surveillance in Baltimore to help shut down. All right, before we get
Wait.
Can I
They use surveillance to what?
to help shut down the movement, to help shut down the protest.
Okay,
Can I
what was
ask
the
another
protest about? Was it about Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, it was the attack on Freddie Gray.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi. So, my name is Malcolm, and I'm going to be giving the affirmative rebuttal speech, which means I'll be dealing with the arguments that Ayush made in his first speech and responding to them over the next 4 minutes. So, is everybody ready?
Yep.
Can everyone hear me all right? You guys in the back? Okay, yeah, cool. So, let's get started. I want to start by dealing with the negative arguments. Before I get into the specifics of what they say about safety and such, I'd like to have like 2 main arguments just to keep in mind as I deal with them. The first is that the topic we are debating today is that the United States federal government should curtail its domestic surveillance in order to promote democracy, which means that the only impact in the round that matters at all is the degree to which democratic discourse is furthered either by curtailing or reducing surveillance or maintaining it at the same level. Until they give you a significant impact to the way that like democratic discourse functions, they're not going to have any reason to be winning the round under like the wording of the topic. Their case about safety is predicated on a fundamental misreading of the sentence we are supposed to be debating about. But then, the second thing to keep in mind is they keep making comparatives to a world without surveillance. Michael and I do not want to abolish the CIA. Our argument is that there is too much surveillance and we should have less of it. Not that we should have like no surveillance at all and live in total anarchy. That's ridiculous. Until they can tell you why a marginal decrease in surveillance, for example, cutting back on the surveillance of radical social movements would be a real problem, they're not going to be accessing any way to actually impact the round. They just tell you that surveillance does things, but they never show you that if you reduce it, it would stop doing those things because they assume it all goes away, which is factually incorrect. Now, let's go to their first argument about safety. The first argument under this is that surveillance is used to gather evidence and stop attacks. But keep two things in mind. The first is that they give you like a news article that says surveillance has been used to stop an attack, which is very different than giving you evidence that says that attack would not have been stopped without the same level of surveillance as we have in the status quo, for two reasons. First, because they never suggest to you that regular policing mechanisms other than domestic surveillance wouldn't have been able to stop this attack. They just say surveillance did it. But, for example, if I want to turn on my car, maybe my car key turns it on, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be able to hotwire it without the car key. At the end of the day, they're not showing you the necessity of the current level of surveillance. But then secondly, right, the important thing to keep in mind here is that they're not showing you that the current level of surveillance is the level that we need to stop all of these attacks. We could probably cut down on our surveillance of social movements a little bit and still be able to stop some of these terrorist attacks. But then, their second argument about deterrence is a little confusing. A couple things. The first of which is that something that Michael alluded to in his questioning section, where he asked whether that this is specific to government surveillance, and they couldn't give you a solid answer, because they tell you that when people are on security cameras, they end up being deterred from committing crimes, but most security cameras aren't operated by the government. If you go into a Wendy's and you see a security camera, the government has nothing to do with it. Wendy is watching you, not Obama. To keep in mind is, again, they never show you specifically that it's the government surveillance and the current level as opposed to a slightly lower level that we advocate for that's actually causing this deterrence to manifest. But even if you don't believe any of the things I just said in response to this argument, they never make a connection back to democracy, so it's not an impact that is relevant to the topic. Now let's go to their second argument about cybersecurity, which I have a lot to say about. The most important thing I'm going to say about it is it again relies on a fundamental misreading of the topic, because the topic says very specifically domestic surveillance, which means surveillance of people within the United States, and they want to spy on Russia. It's not relevant. But also, then they tell you that cyber attacks are going to shut down all of our water infrastructure and we won't have pipes anymore, which is pretty difficult for a computer to do, especially a computer in Russia. But then third, they claim that surveillance is, the current level of surveillance is the only way to stop this, but then they also tell you there have been 10,000 cyber attacks this year. Seems like it's not working. But the final thing to keep in mind is that we probably should be more worried about promoting our democracy, especially since that's what the topic wants us to do, than we should be worried about a guy drinking Red Bull in a Russian basement. All that matters in today's round is preserving productive democratic discourse and allowing social movements to be heard. Thank you.
I'm Mitch. Is this a good volume?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
Pretty much.
Yeah? Okay.
Move that click sideways. Turn the volume sideways.
Everyone's good? Okay. I'd like to start on what the resolution actually means. It says the United States federal government should substantially curtail its domestic surveillance in order to promote democracy. That means that the reason that they have to be advocating for decreasing surveillance is to promote democracy. But that does not mean that we have to tell you that we shouldn't decrease surveillance because of democracy. We can tell you that there is a much more important reason in today's round that we shouldn't reduce surveillance to promote democracy. For example, we're telling you that because we're decreasing surveillance, we're creating a less safe environment for everyone. And that's really important because that means even if you're decreasing democracy, that doesn't matter if people are dying every day because there is an increase in crime because of it. So let's go specifically to our case and the responses that Malcolm gives to it. So first he says that the topic is not about decreasing surveillance and just general impacts. But again, we're telling you that by decreasing safety, we're creating a less safe environment and that that's a lot more important than a tiny impact to democracy that my opponents are telling you about. Then they tell you that they're not advocating for zero surveillance. But the resolution is telling us that there's going to be a substantial decrease in surveillance. And this is really, really important because most of the responses that Malcolm gives in his rebuttal is that surveillance isn't going to completely disappear. But the point of the resolution is that it's going to decrease to such a substantial amount that there's going to be a significant difference. So the impacts that we're telling you about are going to happen, and the impacts that they're telling you about are also going to happen. But at the end of the day, what we're telling you is that insofar as there's going to be a very large decrease in surveillance, because that's what the resolution is asking us to debate, then there's going to be a very large decrease in safety because we're telling you that surveillance increases safety. So let's go to his responses to our first contention. His first response is about some analogy to a car, and the point is he's basically saying that again, surveillance is not necessary. There can still be other ways to create safety without surveillance. This is really important because we're telling you about deterrence. We're telling you that deterrence, uniquely from the government, which is what our evidence is talking about, decreases violent crime by 20%. He tells you first that surveillance is still going to exist. Again, we're telling you that it's going to decrease to such a substantial amount that it's not going to be safe anymore. But second of all, he tells you about this private surveillance. The point is that, sure, private surveillance can exist, but if you have a decrease in government surveillance, that's still going to be a decrease in safety because criminals are not going to be deterred as much to prevent crime. When they know that there's going to be a camera on the sidewalk, they know they aren't going to commit a crime on that sidewalk because they know they're going to get caught for it. So you see a decrease in crime because of that. And then in response to our second contention, he tells you about cybersecurity. Now, he tells you about that domestic surveillance, this doesn't really matter. But we're not talking about spying or anything like that. We're just telling you that when there is cyber attacks on our servers, when there are cyber attacks from other countries attacking us, because of surveillance and because of the tracking that organizations like the National Security Agency does, we're able to track these signals and stop these attacks from happening. He tells you, for example, that the attacks that we're talking about have already happened. And for example, the increase to 10,000 attacks. The reason we know that there were 10,000 attacks is because we stopped them in the first place. So if we decrease surveillance, we're not going to be able to stop the attacks in the first place, creating all of the problems that we're talking to you about in our second contention. Now quickly on their case. They tell you about how there's going to be an increase in trust and civic engagement and that there's going to be a decrease in movements. But at the end of the day, the biggest impact to all of the things that my opponents are talking about is safety. Because you're not going to have a high trust for civic engagement when there's violence happening on the streets, and you're not going to have social movements when there's violence destroying the point of the social movement in the first place. If we decrease safety, then you create a worse environment, that you're going to decrease democracy, and that you're going to create a worse world for everyone. And that's the most important issue in today's round. So for these reasons, we strongly urge a con ballot.
Now you guys need to ask questions.
Okay, so what, 3 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
I have a question for both sides. Wouldn't it both maintain maintain a certain relative level of security and increase the trust of citizens if the government, after a certain amount of time, makes the survey public after a certain amount of time after the initial survey?
Are you talking about our statistics, like the surveys? Oh, you're talking about trust, right?
Yeah, if they made the stuff they survey, the surveillance, public a certain amount of time after it was taken.
Well, neither of us really have a specific poll that's saying oh, trust is going to increase by 7, right? What we're telling you is that we're going to compare the reasons why, democracy, surveillance is going to increase or decrease and how that's going to impact things. So we're telling you that because you decrease surveillance, you decrease safety, and that ends up
My
hurting.
question is not about increasing or decreasing. My question is, what do you think of making the surveillance public after a certain amount of time after the initial date? as such, the citizens of America can look through and decide maybe this wasn't like the best to look at or stuff like that.
Well, we like it. At the point where it's like a government function, we can't just make surveillance public. It's like people can't have control over that because it's a government function. But like it's not something that we can really do.
You can't make what is the government sees public, so the citizens can see what public sees.
Like it's just not something the government. But is there another question?
What does the other side think of it?
You're just we're just gonna move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that domestic surveillance is able to stop attacks in foreign countries like Russia.
Yeah.
Is that a good job for foreign surveillance, not domestic surveillance?
Well, the point is that the attacks are happening on U.S. soil. For example, there are attacks that are coming onto U.S. servers. So I would argue that it's still an attack on, like, insofar as the attack is still happening on the ground, like in the United States. Like, the distinction is between foreign surveillance, which is surveillance occurring in other countries, versus surveillance that's occurring in the United States. And the cyber attacks are still attacking places like the U.S. government and other places like that, which are in the United States. So I would argue that domestic surveillance still covers that. Is there another question? Yeah? Because the resolution is saying that the reason we should decrease surveillance is so that we should improve democracy. That does not mean that we have to argue for improving democracy, right? It just means that they have to impact our democracy. But at the end of the day, we're still impacting to democracy because we're telling you that a decrease in safety would hurt democracy overall. Another question? Last one? Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Where? Oh, yeah.
You talked about how domestic surveillance is solving domestic attacks. What about the job for domestic security?
Well, we're telling you that you can't prevent the attacks if you don't know that the attacks are happening. So if you don't have information on, for example, who's committing the attacks or aren't able to create the evidence to be able to catch the criminals in the first place, then you can't stop the attacks from happening. Obviously, you need security, but without surveillance, you won't be able to stop the attackers. Thank you.
All right, I'm back. And I'm going to do what Mitch just did and answer some questions. So we're going to start. Are there any questions? Yeah, do the question.
How does this promote democracy if state governments regularly voted?
Oh, sure. So we say that when the federal government, like in our first argument, we say that when the federal government reduces surveillance, like citizens trust the government as a whole more, which means that they're more like incentivized to go out and vote because if you don't trust something, you're less likely to participate in it. Does that make sense? Okay. Do we have another question? Yeah.
So, insofar as the resolution specifically says that it has a substantial decrease, how can you argue that's not really
Okay, so we're not saying it's going to be only a tiny decrease. We're just saying all of the comparatives that they made in their argumentation was saying, oh, if we get rid of surveillance, we won't do this, right? The problem is more that their arguments relied on us saying no surveillance at all, and we're just saying substantial decrease, which I admit is a pretty substantial decrease, but they don't give you a single argument that demonstrates that that will be enough to like have the impact that they advocate for having. So next question. Yeah.
What's your opinion on my last question or the public surveillance question thing?
Well, two things. I'd say that it's not really a question for this debate round. It's a little irrelevant. We're happy to talk about it later sometime. But I think that it's also sort of not feasible for the government to do it, and I'd rather the government have the information and share it with us. Another question?
Thank you.
Top up there.
Yeah, so it's fact that surveillance decreases security. So there's a clear correlation between surveillance and increase in safety. So because democracy is very much dependent on people, wouldn't a decrease in surveillance decrease democracy?
So I contest two things about that, and it's sort of what I said in my last speech. First, I'd argue that surveillance does very little less for security than what my opponents, seemingly you, are telling me, because other policing mechanisms can do just as well. For example, standard investigations and stuff. They don't tell you why that wouldn't be successful. And then second, I'd also argue that the round is about democracy, so we should be focusing on this public discourse. So move on. Yeah, we're going right.
Yeah, so you're saying that they don't have like that amount of security to be enough to like stuff, but at that point, how can you security enough to
Right, so as the affirmative side, I think we have a little bit of leeway on choosing what we want to advocate for. And in Michael's final speech, you'll see that like what we class as the answer to the arguments we made. So yeah. You're allowed. No, I disagree. I think, for example, if the government were to cease surveillance of radical social movements, you would consider that a substantial decrease, and we wouldn't necessarily see that difference. I only have 2 seconds left. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is going to be a 2-minute speech summarizing why we want this round, because obviously. Alright, the resolution says the United States federal government should curtail surveillance in order to promote democracy. That's what they're arguing. We're saying they shouldn't curtail their surveillance because of it increases crime. Like, there's 2 different things. Like, they're saying we should decrease surveillance because it promotes democracy, and we're saying we should keep surveillance because of other reasons. Both exist in both worlds. But even if you don't buy that, we link into their impacts. Like, we don't have to provide any impacts to democracy because we turn their case. Okay, so then they argue this substantial thing. This is the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard. Literally, they're saying that there's a substantial decrease in surveillance is not going to lead to our impacts. In this round, because they don't provide you what a substantial decrease in surveillance means, at the end of the day, both the big negative and the big affirmative impacts of surveillance are going to be weighed in today's round. Otherwise, it would be a wholly uneducational debate. All right, the first main reason why you vote for us is because of safety. The most unique impact in today's round is what we brought up in case, that there's a direct 20% decrease in violent crime because of government surveillance. That's a unique impact of government surveillance. I don't care if Wendy's also has cameras. Whether they have cameras or not doesn't matter because the government has cameras on the sidewalks. So that's why I know Big Brother's watching. But then the second thing is that unless they get the cybersecurity issue, right? They respond to us by saying that domestic surveillance doesn't matter. The reason why it's half these attacks are happening are foreign surveillance. Some people brought that up. The issue is that A, we need domestic surveillance to know that these attacks are going to be happening, and B, these attacks are happening on private companies as well as the government, which means that in order to find out how to respond to these attacks, we need to be surveilling these private companies, and that's what happens in our world, and that's why we've stopped 10,000 attacks, and those 10,000 attacks would not be stopped. Then they impacted trust, your voter turnout. But the issue is, you don't trust the government when your friends and family are dying. They still haven't responded to that. We don't let them respond now. And the social movements, they don't prove it's widespread. Maybe they gave one example of Black Lives Matter, one protest being stopped. But at the end of the day, because the most it's literally the biggest social movement today is in the modern society, and every single person in this room knows about it. I don't think surveillance is very effective at shutting it down. Thank you.
So I'm giving the affirmative closing statement. It's 3 minutes. So let's go through the main issues in today's debate and see why the affirmative has won. So first, let's talk about their arguments, and we'll start with crime. They give us 2 reasons why. The first is that there's going to be more attacks or something, and they talk about how it's going to lead to a less safe environment. But they don't prove this is unique to non-surveillance. If we get rid of surveillance, we can bring more standard policing methods that can do an equally effective job. They don't prove that surveillance is doing a better job than the alternatives that would happen in our world, so for that they have no offense. Second of all, they're not promoting democracy. The resolution says to promote democracy, so you can buy their argument, but really what this debate is promoting democracy, and since they're not promoting democracy, you're not going to win at all. And because of that, and then because they can't access their impact, they can't access what they're going to be saying about a less safe environment, that means that our first point about civic engagement still stands. People are going to trust the government more, go to the polls more, and there's going to be more participation in democracy. The second thing they talked about is crime. And as I brought up in the first cross-examination, and Malcolm brought up in rebuttal, they use crime, it's private cameras, right? If you go into a restaurant, if you go into a store and you see a camera there, the government isn't watching you. It's not Big Brother watching you. It's the owner of the Wendy's. It's the owner of the store. That's not government surveillance. That's not going away. So they can't gain any offensive off of that. So what we see is that none of their arguments have any weight left. So now let's move on to ours and see why we win. First, let's talk about social movements in our second warrant, which Malcolm brought up in a little bit. Now, basically, what happens is that when we basically what happens is that surveillance is used to shut down these social movements and to stifle their progress. For example, we showed you in our case, and Malcolm have mentioned again in rebuttal, that these social movements, these surveillance is being used to shut down these social movements in protests. So for example, the militarized police response to the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore were mobilized by social movements. When we get rid of the surveillance, we get rid of the ability for governments to we get rid of the ability for the government to surveil these social movements, and as a result, they have more mobilization, they have more freedom, and that's more democracy. Now, they've been asking us throughout this debate, and we've been asking cross-examination, what significantly curtail means. And what significantly curtail means not shutting down all operations, but shutting down these operations that are leading to the literal militarization of police and allowing them to mobilize against these social movements. And when these social movements don't have leeway, what we're going to see is that they have less progress, they have less impact, they have less ways to affect change in our democracy. Now let's go to our second point briefly, about civic engagement. Now and we say basically that because people have less trust in the government, they're less likely to vote. If you're not trusting the government, you're not going to vote. Now their only response to this is that, oh, there's going to be more safety, and that in our world, if there's less safety, so people are less likely to go vote. But we show you that's not the case because we proved to you that in their first point that they aren't showing any unique impact on their side. They can't show you that the alternatives are going to be any less safe. They're saying that surveillance keeps us safe. We explain that other standard methods keep us just as safe. So in that we're not going to be any safer if their response doesn't work, and people are going to be more active in democracy and more likely to vote. Thank you.